Hi there. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Matthew Sheffield. This is Theory of Change. So we've got another great show for you today. And it's a technology program, so if you are a technophobe, maybe this one may not be for you if you're here for the religion and politics, but hopefully you'll stick around. So without further ado, I'll get into the intro here. So if you live in the world today, you are surrounded by technology. It's there when you wake up, you use it throughout the day, and it's there when you go to sleep. We often don't think enough. We don't think enough about just how much our lives have changed because of tech. If you're a millennial or older, though, chances are you remember a time when payphones existed, when everyone went to the movie theater, and lots of people didn't have an email address. A lot has changed for us all along the way, but the technology industry itself has changed a lot from those early days in the 1990s and even earlier. So it's worth taking stock of what happened over the years, not just to remember how things were, but because a lot of the things that happened, people have talked about how history is circular at times, and that is also the case with regard to technology. So joining me to discuss all this is David Adams. He's the founder and publisher of osnews.com. It's a publication that covers larger technology trends and larger technology and platform trends. He's also the chief product officer at Equiem, which is a software company that serves the commercial real estate market. Thanks for being here, David.
Hello, thank you.
All right. Well, so this is it's a big topic, but I wanted to, for those who haven't heard of OS News or reading it, let's just talk a little bit about what OS News is. It's one of the first technology publications out there. You started in 1997, right?
Yeah, when we started OS News, I'd already been, a very early computer user and enthusiast, and in the mid to late 90s. There were some very exciting things happening with technology. The dot-com boom was just getting going, but the personal computing space was a little dismal because Microsoft was ascendant, and they were consolidating their hold on the personal computer. Apple was sort of at its lowest point, and it was not even certain whether it was going to survive. And a lot of the interesting things that have happened over the past decades with Linux and with mobile computing were really just in their earliest stages. And so I started OS News as a way of sort of tracking and I guess in a way even championing some of these trends that looked to make the computing space more vibrant and more competitive and more interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that moment for Apple, it's something that a lot of people are not. It's like they never heard of it or they don't remember it at the time. But I think it was a really interesting moment for Apple at that moment, because in the 90s they were pushing their original Mac OS operating system in computers, and it was totally obsolete. And Microsoft had come out with Windows 95, and it had some problems, but it was a lot more stable. And then they came out with Windows NT shortly, or actually before that, and then plopped Windows 95 onto it, the shell. And they were just totally crushing Apple. And Apple really had nothing to offer, business computer users, people who needed their computers not to crash. Like that's a thing that, even that's a thing that's changed, substantially in the past 20 some odd years, that, people forget that in the early days, computers crashed all the time.
Yeah, it's much, much less likely now that you're going to be working on an important term paper for school, and your computer is going to crash and you're going to lose all your work. But that
I
was
know you can't use it as an excuse anymore.
But yeah, Apple, the truth is both Microsoft and Apple in the early 90s had operating systems that weren't particularly stable. But Microsoft in the late 90s had a lot more to work with as far as a war chest, and they muddled through and were able to transform Windows into something that was pretty lousy into something that was pretty good, just by throwing resources at it. And Apple, on the other hand, had made an attempt at designing its own modern operating system, which was codenamed Copeland, and that project failed. A former Apple executive, Jean-Louis Gasset, had started an upstart operating system company called B, and they made the BOS was quite exciting and modern, and they were actually making a play to be acquired by Apple and have that operating system be the basis for Apple's new operating system. And then out of nowhere, Steve Jobs comes back, riding a white horse practically.
Because Steve Jobs was fired from Apple.
He had been fired by Apple CEO, for being an asshole, which he was. And but in the meantime, he had started a couple of other companies. One of them was Pixar Animation Studios, which ended up being very successful, and the other one was Next, which built a new operating system based on an old operating system. So they had taken a version of Unix that and Unix was a very stable sort of enterprise-grade operating system that had been around for a couple of decades and had a few sort of academic forks. So there were some commercial versions of Unix. Yeah. Most of the big tech firms, AT&T, Hewlett-Packard, Digital, they all had versions of Unix that they used on their big servers. But hobbyists and academics had taken up had made some versions of Unix, and Steve Jobs had used one of those as the basis for the Next computer that he developed. And when Apple acquired Next, brought Steve Jobs back, they decided that they were going to build the next version of the Apple operating system on that technology that they built for Next, which was built on really kind of an old and somewhat crusty operating system. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is that those origins, those Unix origins, are what the modern Apple Mac OS are built on, and are also the Linux operating system also comes from some of those same origins, and that's what Android is built on. So that the interesting thing about what's happened in the operating system world in the past 30 years is that an operating system sort of kernel that was already old by then is sort of still kicking around in a lot of our most modern high-tech devices. It's got some staying power.
Yeah, well, and that strategy though for bringing Next and Steve Jobs back, it was kind of like a take-two strategy though for Apple, because they also were trying to do that earlier on their own with AUX, Apple Unix, and that it was it's unfortunately it was an abortive project that never really got anywhere, but it's kind of fascinating as a museum piece if anybody's interested in checking that out. I'll put a link. There's a guy out there named Nathan Lineback who has a website called the GUI, Graphical User Interface GUI Gallery, and he has information on all kinds of historic operating systems and shows you what they look like. So it's a fun site if you are into computing history. So I'll put a link to that. But yeah, and so no, and you're right that is a great example, as you said, though, about how, even technology, people think of it as, just this always moving forward in one direction, always and never looking backward. But that really isn't how it works. I mean, even Windows itself, it has Windows NT, which is the basis of all, subsequent current versions of Windows, owes a lot to VMS, which is another operating system from the 70s.
A competitor to Unix. Actually, when I first became familiar with the internet and as the administrator of a Gopher server. Gopher was a pre-web, a pre-World Wide Web internet protocol for sharing text-based data. That was on a VMS server. So I learned how to do file management and sort of navigate in a VMS system back in the early 90s. And we're in a situation now where we have a lot of good operating systems to choose from. Windows has become very good, and I think the Mac OS has become very good, and Linux has become a really you don't have to be nearly as much of a geek to use a Windows desktop or laptop, or excuse me, a Linux desktop or laptop, like maybe you would have had to be 20 years ago. Android, iOS, we've got a lot of capable platforms for operating computing devices, and so many of the things that were frustrating back in the olden days, back in the bad old days, having an operating system that wasn't stable,
memory safe,
having operating systems that were too incompatible with one another, and having hardware that was too slow or too heavy or too small or whatever,
too expensive.
So many of those problems have gone away, and we have this embarrassment of riches of like fantastic computing devices to use. But now the problems are a little bit more subtle, and they have a lot more to do with the fact that the operating system itself, and the device and the operating system working in concert together, it's no longer the dominant paradigm for computing, because the operating systems now are increasingly dependent on services that are related to them. There's an ecosystem component to personal and business computing that is new, and the strength of these ecosystems and the sort of the lock-in and the control that the vendors of these ecosystems have is becoming more and more important to everybody's sort of daily computing existence. And it's almost to the point where you can have great hardware that's running great software, but increasingly you're limited in what you can actually do with these devices
That you
primarily
own.
by the permission that you have from that ecosystem's owner, that dictates sort of how you can operate.
Yeah, no, and we'll explore that further. But I think where this, I mean, this has always been a dynamic in computing. So, like, one of the things that was instrumental in Microsoft's early success was that they were very developer friendly. So, or people who wanted to make software, so they didn't charge you for development tools, or just for some of them, or they charged much lower prices. So, like, if you wanted to become a computer programmer in the 80s or the 90s, there were other companies out there that sold, programming languages, compilers, but they were expensive, and Microsoft stuff wasn't, and it was in some cases free. It was very well documented, at least by comparison, right? And so, that was a huge part of why they succeeded. But then I'd say you could even go back to look at early, I mean, really the first mass market computers for people were the early arcade machine, the early home arcade systems, the Ataris, the Intellivisions, ColecoVision, and all of those. This problem keeps sort of remanifesting itself over and over in terms of how much openness. For the longest time, openness in terms of a platform vendor was an advantage that you could have. But now, for things have become so big and so massive that the openness is now becoming a disadvantage for some people and some companies, I would say.
Well, so, the downside to openness is
where they see it as,
yeah. Well, the downside to openness from the point of view of the consumer is the amount of chaos that it can potentially bring into your user experience. So, one of the reasons why Apple computers have typically been a little bit more friendly for consumers to use is the fact that the ecosystem is more controlled. The computers are only made by one vendor. There's a limited number of hardware components inside those computers that you need like special device drivers for. And so, the likelihood that you're going to, plug in a new device to your computer, or that you're going to install a new program and that it's going to cause some other component of the system to break down, that's always been less of a danger on an Apple computer than it has been on a Windows computer. And that's mostly because the Windows computer, the Intel platform is open to hundreds of thousands of different hardware suppliers that are all providing computer components that you can use, and the Windows operating system is set up to support all of them. And so you'll install a video card, or you'll install a Bluetooth card or something like that in your computer, and sometimes it'll just work. Other times you might have to go and download a device driver or something, and you can run into lots of different troubles. Things can go wrong because there's so many different moving parts that are controlled by different people. So that's been sort of the traditional downside of the more open platform. Sometimes it can be a little bit less user friendly. It can be a little bit less fault tolerant. But the other downside to the more open platform is what malicious actors can take advantage of the openness. in order to in order to create malware that you can accidentally install on your machines. There's more open platforms have a bigger surface for attack. It's kind of astounding that there's a sub economy out there of scammers and thieves and ne'er-do-wells that are out there, trying to steal your money, trying to trick you into doing things that you shouldn't do. And one of the reasons that consumers have gravitated toward or have begrudgingly accepted the limitations of a more closed ecosystem for their computing devices is that it does provide you with a level of safety. It is much, much harder to end up installing something onto your iPhone that's going to harm you, or it's going to harm your platform in some way, than it is on a Windows PC
or Android, even, frankly.
Or Android, right? And that's because Apple has both designed their operating system and has this very, very controlled ecosystem for apps in the App Store, that it just makes it harder to develop a malware app and actually get it through the controls to where somebody can go and install it on their iOS device. Compared
and just to, so that's what so the advantage of a closed ecosystem, some people have really seen it as that. And but open or closed, in any case, an ecosystem, computing ecosystem, that the rise of ecosystem computing, that really, I think, kind of, I don't know what, took a negative impact on companies trying to enter the market first. We could see that with the smartphones, where you had multiple different vendors have now, and with lots and lots of money, have tried to get into the mobile space and tried and failed. So you had, BlackBerry tried to revamp their antique operating system and come out with a new one. Then you had, and that went nowhere. And you had Microsoft did two different, or actually three different attempts at that. And even they couldn't pull it off. And then you had Palm.
Nokia that absolutely dominated cell phones in the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
They made some very good smartphone operating system moves, but weren't able to really penetrate.
Yeah. And then you had Palm, tried to reconfigure itself. And couldn't do it. And I still have a soft spot in my heart for WebOS, and although the screens on those things were so small, like, people just couldn't take it, and the keyboards were as well. But yeah, but the thing that they all lacked, it wasn't that they didn't have good hardware necessarily. Like in the case of the Nokia devices, they had some great hardware. And the Microsoft devices, were using the exact same chips, and screens and processors as the Android ones. But they didn't have the developer mind share, and they couldn't build the ecosystem on their own, and it collapsed.
It's all about the apps, and it's about whether the third-party apps that consumers want are going to be available on that platform. I mean, that was the thing that almost killed Apple in the 90s.
There's actually Microsoft that saved them.
Yeah, I mean,
ironically,
the thing that almost killed Apple in the 90s was that app developers looked at the cost of developing a Windows version and a Mac version of their app, and they increasingly said, maybe we'll just get by with a Windows version. And so the apps that you wanted to use weren't always available on the Mac. And if they were, sometimes they weren't that good. And you're absolutely right. One of the things that saved the Mac platform was Microsoft supporting the Mac with Microsoft Office, which was always and continues to be one of the most important apps or suite of apps in the personal computer. And
they also gave them money too, if you remember.
Yes, and made an investment.
They invested,
and it wasn't out of the goodness of Bill Gates's heart. It was because Microsoft was under an incredible amount of antitrust scrutiny at the time, and they're like, okay, well, if we can keep a weakened Apple on life support, then that's gonna keep us from getting broken up by the government. And it worked. It got the feds off of Microsoft's case, and it enabled Apple to become one of the most valuable and successful companies of all time. And then, but Microsoft is also as big and as profitable as it ever has been. So because it sort of worked out for both of them. The thing that ended up really saving Apple, though, was a combination of a reinvigorated Mac OS market. They, after Steve Jobs came back, they made the operating system better. They had some very appealing computer designs that really resonated with people, like the iMac and the PowerBooks and MacBooks that started getting really good. But so when their platform ended up being invigorated, then that brought the app developers back. And so you no longer had to make that terrible decision about, oh, if I'm going to use this platform, are there going to be apps? But
and it also, also it did, by basing it on Unix, it also made them compatible with a lot more software than they had.
But honestly, I think the thing that was probably more important than that, not only for the reinvigoration of the Mac, but also the thing that allowed the new mobile operating systems to rise up, both from Apple and Android, and it allowed Linux to become more relevant as an everyday personal computer platform, was that native apps for PCs became less important with the rise of the internet, with the rise of software as a service. It used to be that, if you wanted to run a spreadsheet, then, you better be running an operating system that you can run a spreadsheet on. Nowadays, if you want a spreadsheet, you can sign up for innumerable different web-based spreadsheets, from Google Sheets to lots of others, and you don't have to install spreadsheet software on your computer at all. You can run it in the cloud, and even a lot of the everyday apps that we run on our computers are the actual app that you install on your system is really just a frame. It's a framework around which a web service runs. So, for example, if you're running Slack, a lot of people in the business world are running Slack. They have it open all day. They're using it for chatting with their business colleagues. You can install an app for Slack on your computer, or you can run it through your browser. But if you install the Slack app, it's basically just a little web browser that the Slack service runs on.
Inside of,
and so it's much less. It's running apps natively on your device. It's it's less common, it's less important than it used to be, because so many of these services are really, they're a hybrid service. They run on your device, but they wouldn't operate at all without being connected to the cloud-based software as a service framework upon which the entire thing is dependent. And
Yeah.
that's a blessing. That's a blessing and a curse, because it does actually make it easier for you to run the software that you want to do, without paying that much attention to which computer you're using or which operating system it's running on. But again, it's putting a lot of power into the vendor of that software. For example, if Slack were to cease existing, if they were to stop running their services, it wouldn't work anymore. You wouldn't be able to just because you paid for it and had it installed on your computer, it wouldn't do anything. And a lot of our software is like that. Microsoft, now they still do have old-fashioned versions of Word and PowerPoint and Excel that will run on a computer that's not connected to the internet. But increasingly, people are running the versions of those apps on the cloud, and there's benefits to it, but there's also costs and dangers, and it puts a lot more power. It puts a lot more power on the vendor to gatekeep your control of it, and to surveil you. It gives them a lot of power to data mine your everyday activity and use that to sell advertising,
or do other things. Yeah.
Yes, to convince you to buy things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then also, this network dependency, it's a, and people don't often think about computing history or technology history as being something that exists or even worth existing if they might think of it. But like being able to, if I somehow got my hands on, let's say, well, we were talking about an Apple Newton before on the pre-show here. If I go downstairs and get my Apple Newton, which I have, and turn it on and put some batteries in and turn it on, I can still use that software. I can transport myself back to the mid-90s in that system and see how it really was, see how people used things at that moment. But let's say 30 years from now, and somebody, let's say they read a novel where somebody mentions Slack or somebody mentions Twitter or something, and those things don't exist. Yeah. There is no way for a person in the future to experience something the way that it was.
You can't, and that's a loss. You can't go back and use America Online like it was in 1996. Can't be done. That's right.
Yeah.
It's lost. It's lost in the ether.
It is. And, and I think that's, for companies that are large enough to afford it, I think that's something that all of them should be keeping in mind, to try to preserve a historical record for the future societies so that people can see how things were. Because this will be, as we become more network dependent on our computing needs, this is a history that's being lost in a sense. And it's worth marking that.
Yeah, yeah. It occurs to me, you said something to the extent, to the effect of everything old is new again. It occurs to me that in a way we have come full circle with the computing user experience, because for the first couple of decades of computers, the computer was a giant appliance that was installed in some data center somewhere, and you would access it via some kind of a terminal, and multiple people would access the same computer.
And you all had a separate login, yeah.
Yeah, and that's how computers were. You know, when Bill Gates, one of the reasons why Bill Gates became Bill Gates was because he came from a relatively privileged family, and he, as a young person, actually had access to a computer. He had access to a computer terminal like during off hours, and that enabled him to learn how to be a programmer. And at that time, it was very, very difficult to get yourself as a young person into a circumstance where you had access to a computer and you could learn to program. So he was in a very, very small priesthood of people that was able to have that knowledge, and that enabled him to be successful. And so, you know, in the 80s, this era of the personal computer emerged, where, you know, you could have your own computer on your table and you would have exclusive access to that computer, and that was amazing. But people realized that one of the advantages of the computer, of the sort of the previous sort of shared notion of computers, was that there was actually some benefit to sharing a single computer with multiple people. You could send messages to them. You know, you could send them an email back in the 70s. You know, you could send emails to other people that were on the same computer system as you. That was handy because you didn't have to walk over to the other building where they were in, right? And you could set up communities and you could chat with people. And so now we had this situation in the 80s where you have personal computers and you can do certain things on those computers. You can play games by yourself. You can write, you can do word processing by yourself. You can use a spreadsheet by yourself. But it didn't take people long to realize, you know, wow, it would be, you know, we've lost something. And so it didn't take long for people to start hooking those personal computers up to networks. And, you know, at first, a lot of these were private networks in offices, or they were private networks like CompuServe and eventually America Online. And then, you know, eventually putting personal computers on the internet, which, you know, that was the thing that really made personal computers relevant for the masses. It was the combination of having the capabilities of the personal computer plus the communication abilities of the network. And you know, from there, it was about taking that the magic of those two things and going through iterations of improvement, where the computers are getting better, the computers are getting easier to use, they're getting smaller, they're getting less expensive. Eventually, they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you can hold them in your hand, and you've got you know, wireless networking and all of these other things. But it really has just been a progression, kind of an uninterrupted progression of gradual improvements that have gotten us from there to here.
Yeah, it was a regression to the network, a return to the mother, in a sense, you could argue. And you know, I mean, so much of, I mean, a lot of the dynamics that, you know, exist now with social media and disinformation and trolling and, you know, abusive behavior. I mean, these are problems that they existed in the 80s. And, you know, like there's, to this day, there's people who are into computing know about it, but most people don't know about this protocol called Internet Relay Chat, IRC. And that's based on technologies that date to 1988. And, you know, and then there were things that go back earlier, this idea of multi-user chats and things like that. So, but, you know, at the same time, though, that the original, I guess, the mass return to the network took place because the World Wide Web was open standards based. It was based on protocols that were public information that were 100% documented, and did not require you to have a license, did not require you to have permission, and you could use them. So you could have, and that really set up this explosion of activity, both of businesses, nonprofits. I mean, everybody, threw up a website in the 90s. We were both there. I made my first website in 1996. I was in college at the time, made one of the first student newspaper websites out there, college paper websites, at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And we saw so much promise in all this openness. Everybody who was there, I'm sure you probably did as well, right?
This dichotomy between the promises of openness and the dangers of openness have always existed. And I'm going to tell a little bit of an anecdote. So when I first started using the internet, this was pre-web, so it would have been like 1993, 94. One of the things that I really liked to do was to go onto news groups, and you could buy and sell things on news groups. So they had news groups that were, alt.forsale. something, right? And you could go on there, and it was basically Craigslist before there was Craigslist. And I would go on and buy some parts for my mountain bike, or I would buy, some computer components from people. It was like eBay, people selling things to one another. But unlike eBay, there was no PayPal, and people didn't take credit cards. And what was pretty common would be that somebody would mail you something through the mail, and if you got it, then you would send them a check. And the network was built on trust, but it wasn't actually 100% trust, because one of the things one of the hallmarks of using the internet prior to the dot-com boom was that there actually wasn't a huge amount of anonymity on the internet back then, because you usually got your access to the internet through an institution. So when I bought a pair of pedals for my mountain bike from a guy in Boston, I knew who he was. He was a professor at MIT. It was right there in his email address. And so if that professor at MIT, if I sold something to a professor at MIT and he didn't give me the money, I mean, I could call up MIT and be like, "Hey, do you know you have a guy who's like stealing stuff on the internet from people?" And so the fact that there was a lack of anonymity, and that there were institutions involved that had their own, people had their own reputation to consider when they were interacting with people on the internet, actually prevented a huge amount of abuse that happened once everybody started joining the internet, and once people got much more anonymous. Now there was a lot more abuse. And so now you're seeing, and again, we're coming back full circle. We're seeing that, one of the ways that we can prevent abuse is by getting rid of anonymity and getting institutions involved that are going to act as some sort of gatekeeper, or that are going to act as some sort of a brake on certain types of abuses. So if you're not playing nice on the internet, there's some authority that's going to shut you down. In some ways that would be like going back to what I mean, I consider it kind of the good old days, because it was just it was a much smaller group of people that interacted to each other with each other with in a more collegial manner. But I don't think that we would consider losing the freedom and losing the freedom to be anonymous. It's not necessarily a good thing. So there's always this tension between the freedom and openness, but then again, the costs that we pay for existing in this free and open environment. And the costs are that it's fraud. The cost is fraud. The cost is malware. The cost is bullying and abuse. People being able to say what they want with impunity. It has its positives and it has its negatives. Spreading misinformation, and there's no easy answer. There are some powerful entities out there that have incentives to try to promote themselves as being the authorities that ought to be in charge of fixing this. Apple, Google, Facebook, the U.S. government, the European Union. There are a lot.
The Chinese government.
The Chinese government,
they've got their own thing that they're trying.
They've got their ideas about what to do, and it has a lot to do with locking things down and putting themselves up as the gatekeepers. And the truth is, all of these players, they want to promote themselves as the natural gatekeepers, as the natural provider of solutions to these various social ills that are coming from the openness. Mm-hmm. But we have to be extremely skeptical about what it is that they propose, why they're proposing.
Why are they doing it? Yeah.
What's their angle?
Mm-hmm.
Apple's angle for being the arbiter of it is that
before you get into specifically
it Apple's profits, right?
Yeah, well, no, before you get into it though, maybe just say what you're referring to before you talk about why they're doing it. So like, what are they doing? Just for people who don't know.
Right. So when it comes to the big tech firms, a lot of their idea of what they want done to address these social ills is more around what they don't want to have happen, which is they don't want the government to come in with a regulatory approach to solve these problems. And so they're saying
to break them up.
to break them up. Or to create a series of laws that restrict, what they can do, that can restrict the kind of surveillance that they can do on their users, that can restrict the kind of data that they can collect, that can restrict what they can do with that data, who they can share it with, who they can sell it to. So most of the big tech firms, that's their point of view is, we're going to come up with a grab bag of different approaches to what we can do to solve these social problems. And it's not so much that we think that these solutions that we're coming up with are so great, but that they're good enough to forestall the government coming in and doing something.
In Apple's case, what are they doing?
Yeah, so Apple is a little bit of a different case because they don't have a business that's built on selling advertising to anybody. They don't have a business that really is heavily dependent on collecting information about their users and then selling it to other people. Their business is on the care and maintenance of the ecosystem and getting you to buy their hardware, to use their software, and to use apps that are being sold through their app store. And so Apple's approach is, well, let's just let's heavily restrict the amount of data that can be shared, without your knowledge, from one service to another, or from one app to another. So you may have noticed, if you've upgraded recently to a new version of iOS, every time you launch an app for the first time, it brings up a little prompt and it says, this app wants to track your activity and to share it. Would you like to allow them to do that or not? And most people are like, that sounds terrible. I don't want them to track my activity. And so Facebook and Google and all of these other services that have been trying to track you in iOS are now getting shut down, and they can't do it. And so so Apple is like, hey, we can save you from installing malware on your computer. We can save you from having different services tracking your activity. And they're sort of promoting themselves as being champions of privacy. But in exchange, you have to give up the ability to install any app on your iPhone that isn't vetted by Apple. You have to sign up for a developer unfriendly ecosystem where if somebody starts to develop an app that competes a little bit too closely with one of the things that Apple does, then they get shut down.
And they don't let you use a different default email program or a different web browser. You can't do it. They won't allow you to.
Right.
And so, and then the other thing also, though, is that while they are marketing themselves as being pro privacy or pro user, these are promises that they only make to Western users and in democratic society. So meanwhile, they have no problem working with authoritarian countries, so like China or Saudi Arabia. If you're an Apple user in those countries, you don't have these rights with respect to the Chinese government or the government of Saudi Arabia. So if they want to know that you're gay,
right?
They
well,
can
that's
find that
another
out.
huge downside to the ecosystem approach to computing, is that you have choke points where certain private or public entities have access to your whole stream of data, and if the Chinese government says, hey, if you're going to play in China, you have to let us listen in on everything that's happening, or else you can't do it. And we can hear that and we're like, oh yeah, that's terrible. China sucks. Well, newsflash, the U.S. government is doing the same thing. If there have been numerous revelations about the United States government using its powers to get access to internet service providers and other choke points. And they've been the U.S. government, both the federal government and state and local governments have been in a cat and mouse game with Apple about being able to unlock your phone if they confiscate it from you and get at your data. And it's not in Apple has been claiming that it is fighting those attempts, that it's trying to fight the government to keep them from being able to unlock your phones. But it's not entirely certain that your rights, that Apple is actually 100% standing up for your privacy in all cases.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
an opaque.
yeah. Yeah, and like even in the case, but let's say the companies all were officially. The problem of network computing is that you still have individuals within the companies. So like in the case of there was one case I'm thinking of, Twitter had there was an employee who worked in their network at a network level for them that was secretly on the payroll of the government of Saudi Arabia, and this individual was getting people into he was getting in their private messages and
Right, helping to de-anonymize some activists.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I mean, these are issues, and the problem is though that the allure of free is so great that it's hard for people to want to give that up. The idea that you can get free email from Google, in exchange for that they will scan all of your messages and see what things you like so that they can more effectively market advert. Like, that's creepy. And yet, but they got a lot of people signed up for it because they were giving out, gigabytes and gigabytes of storage. And nobody else, when Gmail got started on that, had anywhere near that kind of storage, was letting people have it. And then, there's downsides. I mean, it's not just Google, but like Facebook, of course, wants everyone to put all their photos in there and have all their group messages and their family messages. But I mean, and there's so many downsides to that. Just even in those own specific trends, like let's say you get banned from Facebook, or you decide to delete your account for whatever reason, or something happens to your account, you've lost all that stuff that you had, unless you specifically went and downloaded it. And people have lost things from you, and I think that's how it works. Although I'm not sure if somebody had messaged you. I've never seen what happens with that, but that's an interesting. You know that one? What happens if you had messaged with a deleted account? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's gone. And one of the real dangers of too much centralization is people build livelihoods on online services. If you are if you're a video creator, and you get shut down by YouTube, then you're done, right? If you're an influencer, and they shut down your Instagram or your Twitter, you're in big trouble. You've lost your platform. Then on the other hand, there are a lot of people who are like, well, that's good, because there are people who are influencers on social media that are up to no good. They're spreading misinformation. They're encouraging their followers to engage in violence. They should be shut down, right? And look at all these people that should be shut down that haven't been shut down, right? So it's on the one hand, you can sort of see it both ways. And again, it's that tension between are the benefits that you get from a more decentralized and more free network, are they worth the downsides, right? The internet in general is free, and so because of that, people are going to post things to the internet that you find abhorrent, that you wish didn't exist, right? And I think part of the difficulty of being a proponent of freedom in general is always knowing that, you know, there are going to be people who are using that freedom to do things that you wish that they didn't do or that they couldn't do. But
Yeah.
you know, you have to accept the fact that that's part of the, you know, part of the cost of living in a free society or participating in a free medium, is that there's going to be people out there who are, you know, perpetrating fraud or spewing out hate speech, or, you know, all of the other things that they can do that they wouldn't be.
Well, and deciding where you draw the line ultimately. And, you know, but the thing is, these are complicated questions. They're very complicated, both philosophically, but then also in terms of the practical, you know, the way it actually works. So, you know, but they don't disclose their algorithms, but Facebook, Google, Twitter, whatever, you know, if you were to see them, you know, it would be probably, you know, thousands of pages of programming statements and formulae. And so there's, you know, as platforms have become computing, and computing has become platforms, you know, the ability of other entities that are supposed to bring accountability to those systems has declined. And so you see a lot of, you know, politicians, they have no, like, you know, the congressional Facebook hearings and Twitter hearings, they're just infamous for people getting up there, you know, I turned my phone off one time and I thought it was spying on me when I was in the bathroom, you know. That's the type of stuff. Or my grandson told me he tried to send a picture, but he couldn't do it. Like, that's the level of stuff that you hear on these hearings. And, you know, it's a real problem in terms of that the politicians have no idea what's going on. But then there's other levels. If you look at, you know, a lot of government agencies are in what people have called regulatory capture, that the people who are supposed to oversee these industries are, by and large, entirely comprised of people in those industries or formerly of them, and who very likely would like to return back to that industry if they somehow lost their job for whatever reason, or got a better salary. And then on the political side, you've got, on the media side, you've got that so much of technology reporting and was the technology journalism, such as it was mostly business centric or consumer product centric. And so you had kind of this, you know, boosterism of particular companies. So, like, I mean, even now there's, you know, some journalists who are complete shills for Apple, for instance, or shills for Google, et cetera. And so they encourage people not to be aware of the larger issues, and they themselves have no idea. So it's like there are all these layers that are kind of stopping the rest of society from understanding, you know, the problems of platform computing. And so, I mean, what's your thought on all that?
Well, I mean, my personal ideology is that I would welcome the government finding a way to be a counterbalance for some of the frankly incredible power that big tech firms have been able to have been able to accumulate for themselves. However, I'm very skeptical of the frail humans that are actually involved in the government being able to come up with some sort of regulatory environment that's actually going to do more good than harm. You know, partially because of what you were saying. I mean, it's very likely that any regulation of the social media ecosystem, for example, it's very likely that anything that comes out of a regulatory process is probably going to end up being very carefully designed to bolster and reinforce the power of the incumbent players and make it more difficult for new players to come up and displace them. If you put an incredibly onerous regulatory framework around how people can interact with a social network, it's almost certain that that's going to exist so that it doesn't immediately put Facebook and Google out of business, right? That's a no-go. So if it doesn't immediately kill Facebook, then what it's going to do is it's going to enable Facebook with its vast war chest to tailor its service so that it complies with the what are bound to be extremely complicated and convoluted methods of complying with these regulations. But what that's also going to mean is that an upstart social network service is probably going to find it impossible to comply with those regulations. And so it will never exist. And so that what it'll mean is Facebook becomes the very last social network to ever exist. In a world where a very onerous regulatory framework is put around social networks. And I don't think anybody wants that to happen. And so I think that that over time, as the understanding of these the understanding of this general computing environment and this new sort of virtual world that we live in, over time, I think the government will probably be more we'll probably have a better understanding. Some of the older people will retire and they'll be replaced by younger people, and we'll be in a better situation. I mean, if you go back 100 years ago, the government had no idea what to do with the automobile. You basically had cities and roads that were built around horse-based transportation, and all of a sudden you've got dozens of companies that are building these crazy contraptions that are driving around at high speeds and running people over. And the government, it was like, what do we do about this? And there were all sorts of weird and in retrospect sort of silly attempts at regulating the automobile that happened in the 110, 105 years ago. But eventually the government sort of figured out, okay, here's how our world is changing. Here's how the automobile has changed the world. And, we're gonna figure out how to regulate drivers. We're gonna figure out how to hold car companies to account. And now it's not so much of a misunderstood technology. And maybe we'll get to that point with the internet at some point in the coming decades.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I do think though that that there's the saying, hell is other people. Well, Facebook is other people. And so, that is the temptation, I think, when people talk about manifestations of social problems in a technological way. But these are still things that the human tendencies, group tendencies, you know, a tendency to believe falsehoods that are convenient. These are natural human tendencies, and it's likely that the best, you know, long-term solution for these things is better education, and getting people to understand, you know, how to think properly, understanding what the scientific method means, why empiricism is good, why tolerance is good, why pluralism is good. Like, our educational system doesn't really touch on a lot of those topics. They do kind of sort of on scientific method, but not really. You know, I've talked to professors of, one of the people who is a member of our Flux media network. She teaches science, and she originally was hired to teach biology, and she realized, wow, these students, they don't know anything about science and how it works and why it's good. And so she completely restructured her course in that way. But that's, you know, we need a lot more of that. And because, you know, things that people think as technical problems are not in many cases.
Well, certainly, if you look at if you look at a lot of the real social problems that are being facilitated by technology, it's not necessarily the technology itself that's creating the problem, right? When my mother-in-law gets some kind of a pop-up message on her computer that tells her, that scares her because, you know, somebody is stealing her data and she needs to call this phone number, and she gets connected to a call center in India somewhere where they try to scam her out of her money. It's where the rubber meets the road. It's not the computer that's stealing or that's trying to steal my mother-in-law's money. It's a human being, and it's a network of human beings that have put together a playbook for stealing money from old American ladies.
And they know it to work.
Yeah, and they do it because it gets results, right? And you know, when people are using the power of Facebook, the Facebook algorithm, to, you know, promote some extremist political agenda, or to sell some phony baloney miracle cure, or all of these things that they're doing, you know, the Facebook algorithm and Facebook advertising and the various failures of Facebook to you know, sort of combat these kind of things. It's just a medium for scams and abuses that are as old as time. I mean, is there a scam any older than somebody coming in to your community with some kind of miracle cure and trying to get everybody to buy it? You know, I mean, 6,000 years ago, somebody rode into Uruk on a donkey and tried to sell people a miracle cure and take their money. It's like, these are not new social problems. They're the same old social problems. They're just being perpetrated through a new medium.
Yeah. Well, although I guess the only thing that is different is that it is allowed to be at a greater scale. And that's, you know, and that's where the danger comes in, I think. Because, you know, like, I mean, there have always been people who don't, you know, who have paranoid beliefs about vaccines, for instance. That's always been an attitude that's existed. But if you look at, you know, go back and look at attitudes toward vaccines among, you know, far right Americans in the 1970s, for instance, and compare them now, they were more supportive of them. than they are now. And so, that's the other thing is that, I think from a regulatory standpoint, having systems be smaller, that may be the only real effective way for that to happen. So like making Facebook not be allowed to own WhatsApp, or forcing them to divest Instagram. Like those are things that we know could be positive for society. But in terms of like getting specific regulations, those will be very, very difficult to get correct and to be not harmful. But and then at the same time, I think one of the other things, and this is a societal thing, is that we have to have more of a public spiritedness in business culture in the United States. And that's something that did exist earlier when things were more physical oriented. So like they just simply had to, like they had so many employees who were at their plants and whatnot and they were, unionized and whatnot. So they had to not run them into the ground and treat them like crap. Whereas now, in the technology world, there's kind of this fetish for achieving scale with as little human interaction as possible. That we want to have millions of users and only 5 employees or something like that. Like that's a fantasy. Like that's not just something that is a practice. It is a goal of a lot of companies.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Instagram's probably the best example. Is when Instagram was acquired by Facebook for, $1 billion or whatever it was. I think they only had 80 employees, and that was considered in the technology entrepreneur circles in which I run, that was considered a tremendous accomplishment. To have a company that's generating that much value with so few people, it's like, that's the aspiration.
Yeah, and that's what's missing though from a lot of the discussion. So an algorithm just simply cannot understand the vagaries of human language, and so. Somebody posting a meme, an ISIS sympathizer posting a meme that, of, I don't know, George Clooney, but it's meant to support ISIS. Like a computer is never going to understand that. And whereas a human, who speaks whatever that language is going to understand what the point of that was.
Well, and it's worse than that, because the algorithms are written for a purpose. And, so famously the Facebook algorithms, their purpose, and YouTube also. YouTube and Facebook both built algorithms that their purpose was increased engagement, right? And so, and what we've learned about the downside of building what's essentially an incredibly powerful
conveyor belt.
I was going to say AI, but I don't even know if it let's just say AI. You build an incredibly powerful AI, and powerful in that because it has the power to influence so many people. And you give it this like single-minded determination to increase engagement. And what did we find that did? Well, what it did is it drove people toward extremist content. It poisoned their minds and turned them into fearful, angry mobs, because and the AI didn't care or know what it was doing. All it knew was that if I do this thing, it drives people to engage more. It was, and neither the people who created that algorithm nor the algorithm itself had any notion that this was going to, create a circumstance with all of these negative externalities, all that's ruining the world. But you can make a pretty good case that actually it made the world worse. So there's some real danger there.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's basically, the people who have these deranged viewpoints. So, they think they're, God's servant in Christianity, or in Allah's servant, like that they have to do violence on their God's behalf. That the mentality that makes you have those ideas makes it hard for you to build out a large scale network, because you're deranged. Like, you can't get along with others. You don't play well with the other kids. And so they never really had an ability to build out a large scale network of suicide bombers, let's say. It's difficult. It's not very, very hard. And now these algorithms and companies that act without public spirit in mind, they are basically giving them the platforms. The only thing that they were missing, which was a printing press, in a sense, that they were giving them the method of spreading their hateful and awful message, and they couldn't have built it themselves because they were too stupid.
Right. Well, I said something a few minutes ago about in the context of regulation, and talking about the government not really figuring out what to do about the automobile. And on that topic, I think that you can make a very good case that the world that we ended up creating, partially through the private enterprise of people promoting the automobile and promoting its benefits, the freedom of being able to travel long distances on your own. But the government had to be involved in order to bring that world to fruition, right? If the government weren't involved by building roads and making laws about where cars can go and where they can't, and how cities should interact with cars, and whether businesses should be required to make parking lots, and all of these innumerable individual decisions about how our society is going to relate to the automobile, has arguably created a world that's worse than the one that we could have had the government been like, we're not allowing cars into our cities, right? If in 1920 the government of the United States had been like, or individual state or local governments had been like, no cars, we've got our trolleys, we've got our trains, we want to live in a different world where the streets in our cities belong to pedestrians and not to death machines. We would live in a very different world now, and arguably a better world than the one where we gave our cities over to cars and we gave our suburbs over to parking lots. So there were a lot of decisions that were made, and decisions that were made sort of by default, and we now live in the world that we live in. And I think that we can cast ourselves forward 100 years from now, and we can ask some of those same questions, like, are the values that we're espousing as a society, and are the laws and the regulatory framework that we're putting together in the face of this technological change around these social networks and these communication media and these computing devices that we're carrying around that are becoming more and more ubiquitous and more useful. The world that we're going to live in 100 years from now is going to be very different depending on some of these decisions that we make. And
well, and not to make a decision is a decision. Right. And yeah, and we're not going to solve all the world's problems here in one podcast. But what, that my goal here in talking about all this today, though, was just that there are a lot of things that we as a society have to start thinking about more. And, more people need to be involved in the discussion of our future. And the public needs to care about it. It can be annoying or complicated, but these are things that matter. These are the issues of tomorrow. And so, but yeah, no, I've appreciated the discussion today. Thanks for joining me.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for